Admiral Fletcher, who had maintained a southeasterly course during the night, awoke that morning in somewhat more than his usual fighting mood. Unfortunately, owing to the detachment of Crace's force, he had less to fight with than the day before: 5 heavy cruisers and 7 destroyers to support and screen 2 carriers. But that was one more of each type than Takagi had. More serious, his course had taken him out of the protective cover of a foul-weather front into an area of high visibility. The weather, which had been such an asset to him on May 7th, now became a Japanese ally. The number of planes operational on both sides was almost the same: 121 Japanese and 122 American. The former had the larger proportion of fighter and torpedo planes, and in those types the Japanese excelled. Fletcher, on the other hand, had radar and horning devices which Hara lacked. The enemy carriers had been operating as a division for over 6 months, while Yorktown and Lexington had only recently joined, and the task force had had no practice in tactical manoeuvring. It had the greater number of anti-aircraft guns, the most numerous type being the unsatisfactory 1.1 inch. The aviators on both sides were first-string men. Before the 8th of May broke, Fletcher's principal concern was to locate Shokaku and Zuikaku. Intelligence reports received during the night offered nothing specific. Radio direction finders indicated that Takagi was either to the eastward or the westward, but that was not much help. A 360-degree dawn search was a necessity, and Lexington was given the job. At 6:25 she launched 18 planes. No news came in for almost 2 hours. At 8:15, Lieutenant J.G. Smith obtained the first glimpse of the Japanese striking force vouchsafed to any American pilot. By 8:38 he had reported the composition, course and speed of the disposition, locating it at 175 miles to the northeastward of Fletcher's position. Before his report came in, Lexington had intercepted a radio message from a Japanese search plane giving her own position, course and speed fairly accurately, so it was certain that the enemy was on her tail. Lieutenant Commander R.E. Dixon, flying an SBD that was searching a sector adjoining Lieutenant Smith's, picked up and verified the enemy contact. At 9:30 he sighted the striking force steaming due south at a speed of 25 knots in a position approximately 25 miles northeast of the 815 initial contact by Lieutenant Smith, but about 45 miles north of Takagi's 900 position that had been predicted on the strength of that contact. This discrepancy was to cause trouble. Dixon trailed the enemy until 10:45 when he had to return to Lexington because his fuel was running low. Within a minute of receiving Lieutenant Smith's amplifying report at 8:38, Admiral Fletcher ordered both carriers to launch airstrikes. Unfortunately, his ships were out in the clear sunlight where it was a yachtsman's dream of a perfect trade wind day, but the enemy lay under a protective cover of squall clouds. Before launching was complete, he made Admiral Fitch officer in tactical command, in order to reduce signalling between carriers and to allow him complete freedom of action for his carriers and air groups. At 10 he radioed to General MacArthur his own location and that of the enemy, hoping that the general would send planes to track and bomb the striking force. But Army Air that day made only another non-hit attack on the retreating invasion force. The Yorktown group of 39 planes took departure at 9:15 and sighted the enemy an hour and 3/4 later. Zuikaku and Shokaku, each screened by 2 heavy cruisers and 2 or 3 destroyers, were steaming southwesterly, 8 or 10 miles apart. While the dive bombers, who had climbed to 17,000 feet on the approach, orbited under cloud cover to await the slower, low-flying torpedo planes, Shokaku turned into the wind and began launching more combat air patrol, while Zuikaku and her attendants disappeared into a rain squall. At 10:57, when all Yorktown planes were in position, Lieutenant Commander Joe Taylor of Torpedo Squadron 5 led the attack on Shokaku. Wildcats protected the TBDs from Zeeks as they came in low to launch, and the dive bombers followed. This, the first American attack of the war on a large Japanese carrier, fell far short of anticipation. The torpedoes, launched from too great a distance, either missed or failed to explode, and only 2 bomb hits were scored, one well forward on Shokaku's starboard bow, which fired gasoline and damaged the flight deck so that she could only recover planes but not launch, and the other well aft, which destroyed the repair compartment for airplane motors. When Admiral Hara came out of the squall in Zuikaku, he saw her sister ship burning furiously. Nevertheless, the Yorktown planes seemed to have done better than those of, which took departure 10 minutes later and ran into all kinds of trouble. The 3 Wildcats escorting the SBDs lost them in the clouds and had to return. The torpedo squadron reached the false position predicted from the 815 contact and naturally found nothing there. By flying a box search, it later picked up the enemy, but the dive-bombing squadron, which ran into a thick overcast, never did locate the enemy and returned when it began to run short of fuel. The rest of Lexington's attack group, now reduced to 11 torpedo bombers, 4 dive bombers and 6 Wildcats, found the enemy at about 11:40 after flying 8 minutes on the first leg of the box. An approach was made at 6,000 feet over a cloud, through a hole in which the torpedo attack was launched in a spiraling glide, followed by the dive bombers. 3 Wildcats fell victim to the Zeeks, which greatly outnumbered them but were usefully drawn off from the bombers, enabling them to attack with relatively little air interference. With the TBDs, it was again a case of slow torpedoes and long range. We could turn and run away from them. A Japanese officer recalled Lexington dive bombers added 1 hit on Shokaku to Yorktown's 2, but the report brought back by their pilots that they left 1 big carrier settling fast was greatly exaggerated. Shokaku had lost 108 men deceased and 40 wounded, but she was not holed below the waterline. All fires were quickly brought under control, many of her planes were transferred to Zuikaku, and at 13 she hightailed it for home. She almost capsized on the way and arrived in bad shape, but she got there, and we shall hear of her again. Admiral Takagi had no qualms about releasing Shokaku, for by this time he believed that both United States carriers were well settled on the bottom of the Coral Sea. By the time the American planes began returning to their carriers, both flat-tops had been hit. 70 planes from Shokaku and Zuikaku were beating up the American carriers a few minutes after Yorktown's attack on the Japanese carriers ended, and before Lexington's had commenced. In this strange criss-cross air battle, superior success attended the Japanese, whose strike group was larger and better balanced and more accurately directed to its target than that of the Americans. Retaliation had been anticipated even before the American strike took its departure. Shortly after sunrise, Yorktown and Lexington began slicing off planes for combat air and anti-submarine patrol. At 10:30, Fitch changed course to 28° in order to reduce the distance flown in his returning planes. Topside in Lexington, which conducted fighter directions for both carriers, lookouts and airmen scanned the sky, and radar sent out its feelers for battle portents. On the strength of Japanese carrier radio activity heard during the forenoon watch, Captain Ted Sherman predicted that an enemy strike would come in about 11. Everyone prepared for action according to doctrine. General quarters, flight quarters, ships buttoned up and battened down, additional planes sent aloft to nip the nips. First sign of the attack came as predicted at 10:55 when Lexington's radar picked up a large group of bogies about 70 miles to the northeastward. Despite Sherman's prediction, the fighter director officer was not prepared. 1 patrol had just been recovered, and only 8 Wildcats were over the carriers at that time. They were too low in fuel both to intercept and fight, so were ordered to stay close by the ships. The 2 carriers changed course back to 125°, bent on 25 and then 30 knots, and immediately commenced launching relief combat air patrol of 9 Wildcats. 5 were sent out on the hopeless mission of trying to stop an enemy many times their strength. 2 of them flew low to intercept the Japanese torpedo planes, but escorting Zeeks kept them too busy to do it. 3 others, although flying at 10,000 feet, were not high enough to reach an attack position before the Japanese dive bombers reached their pushover point. The other 4 were vectored out 15 miles, but missed the interception and hurried home. Admiral Fitch had far too few fighter planes. They were not well employed, and his 23 Dauntless dive bombers which were in the air looking for torpedo planes were inadequately gunned and too slow to double as fighters. 4 of them were shot down trying, although they disposed of as many torpedo planes, so the battle quickly resolved itself into a duel between American anti-aircraft gunners and Japanese planes. At 11:18 the battle busted out, as one of the sailors remarked. The Japanese approached from the northeastward, down wind and down sun. A fresh trade wind was blowing from half a point north of east. The sea was smooth and visibility high. Torpedo bombers came in on both bows of Lexington to launch their fish at half to three-quarter mile ranges from an altitude of 50 to 200 feet. One of the first pair was taken apart by 5-inch shells. When the first torpedo splashed into the water on Lexington's port bow, Captain Sherman ordered full right rudder maneuver nullified almost immediately by the appearance of torpedoes on the starboard bow. The captain made strenuous efforts to swing the huge bulk of the valiant lady into a safe alignment parallel to the wakes, 11 of which were reported as passing under, alongside and forward. But she was not easily manoeuvred. Her tactical diameter was 1,500 to 2,000 yards, compared with 1,000 yards for her consort, and it was impossible to evade so many fast torpedoes. One hit on her port side forward at 11:20 was quickly followed by a second on the same side opposite the bridge. To add to her embarrassment, a big dive-bombing attack developed while the torpedo evasion measures were at their height. The Vals, unmolested except by intermittent anti-aircraft fire, commenced their runs at 17,000 feet and discharged their lethal loads at 2,500 feet. One small bomb exploded in a 5-inch ready ammunition box on the port side of Lexington's main deck forward. Another scored on the smokestack structure. Near misses ruptured plates and raised huge plumes of ominously black water. The screaming of the ship's siren, jammed in operation by an explosion, added weird shrieks to the cacophony of battle. It was all over in 19 minutes. Meanwhile, Yorktown was getting her share. The first 3 of 8 torpedoes were dropped on her port quarter at about 11:18. She increased speed to 30 knots and manoeuvred to avoid. Fortunately, she had a much smaller turning circle than Lexington, and on her the Japanese did not use the anvil technique on both bows. After a 5-minute respite, Yorktown was attacked by dive bombers at 11:24. For the next 3 minutes she dodged steel eggs, then received her one and only hit. An 800-pound bomb struck the flight deck 15 feet inboard of the island and penetrated to the 4th deck. 66 men were eliminated or seriously injured. Fires were started but quickly brought under control. A couple of other bombs near missed, but owing to skillful handling by Captain Buckmaster, Yorktown escaped with damage that did not impair flight operations. A single torpedo plane launched a fish at her at 11:40, and that too was dodged. During this radical manoeuvring, it was impossible for the 5 cruisers and 7 destroyers that were screening the carriers to keep formation, especially as the flat tops were constantly drawing apart. One group stayed with Lexington and one with Yorktown, each ship blazing away at the attacking planes and dodging the few bombs and torpedoes that came her way. The Japanese were after carriers only and believed they had got them. Exuberant pilots reported to Happy Hara that they had sunk one large enemy carrier, which they identified as Saratoga, and one medium, either Enterprise or Yorktown, and that they had left burning one battleship or cruiser. Analysis of Japanese reports shows a loss of only 30 planes on the 8th of May as a result of combat, and 13 more operationally, or a total of 43 against 33 lost that day from all causes by Task Force 17. The big carrier battle was over by 11:45 May 8th. If the Coral Sea score had been frozen then and there, the United States could justly have claimed the victory. One Japanese light carrier, one destroyer and several minecraft had been sunk, and a large carrier sent home for repairs, as against the loss of one destroyer, one oiler and 2 large carriers damaged apparently not very seriously. But the final score of naval battle is not made up until ships return to port, and the one that never did reversed profit and loss in the enemy's favour. The end of the battle found Lexington listing 7 degrees, with 3 boiler rooms partially flooded, plane elevators inoperative and 3 fires burning, but before gun barrels grew cold, the flight deck was readied to launch and recover aircraft. While planes settled on deck, damage control and Black Gang brought her back to an even keel by shifting oil ballast. An hour passed, and the ship's company had reason to rejoice. The proud lady was wounded, yet showing a clean pair of heels and conducting nearly normal flight operations. Commander H.R. Healy, the damage control officer, in a telephone report to Captain Sherman, grew facetious. We have got the torpedo damage temporarily shored up, the fire's out, and soon we'll have the ship back on an even keel. But I would suggest, sir, that if you have to take any more torpedoes, you take them on the starboard side." No sooner were those words out of Pop Healy's mouth than at 12:47 a devastating internal explosion shook the carrier from stem to stern. Gasoline vapours, released by one of the torpedo hits, had been ignited below by a motor generator left running. More eruptions followed, each more violent than the last. Internal communications deteriorated rapidly. Central Station, the nerve centre of damage control, suffered major damage and casualties, Commander Healy among them. Smoke burst from the lower decks. Even then the situation seemed hopeful to sailors on the bridge. Flight operations continued. Planes of the morning attack group were recovered, the last plane being received on board at 14:14. The ship still made 25 knots. Only as link after link in the communication system was severed did the officers come to the reluctant conclusion that the lady was too hot to handle. A second major internal explosion at 14:45, which wrecked the ventilation system of the fire and engine rooms, caused Captain Sherman to ask assistance from other vessels in fighting fires. Half an hour later, flight operations were abandoned. Yorktown was requested to recover all airborne planes, and Admiral Fletcher, who had resumed the tactical command at 15:10, was asked to furnish standby rescue vessels. Destroyer Morris eased alongside and passed fire hoses to the lady in distress. Engulfing flames made this gesture ineffective. As Captain Sherman reported, by this time the fire was beyond control. Additional explosions were occurring. It was reported the warheads on the hangar deck had been at a temperature of 140 degrees. Ready bomb storage was in the vicinity of the fire, and I considered there was danger of the ship blowing up at any minute. I had previously directed sick and wounded to be disembarked in our whaleboats, and excess squadron personnel had gone on lines to the destroyer alongside. With engine rooms untenable and communications reduced to one slim telephone line, the Black Gang was ordered to make its way topside after securing engines and boilers. Steam safety valves were lifted, and the ship, drained of her lifeblood, wallowed to a stop at 16:30. All hands prepared to abandon ship. Rafts were cast loose, lines trailed in the water, and a search made below for the helpless wounded. Although the sick bay had to be evacuated and all patients transferred to the captain's cabin, there was ample time for the surgeons and pharmacists' mates to give injections, administer blood plasma, dress wounds, cover horrible skin burns with tannic acid, and lower some 150 wounded in basket stretchers into whaleboats. The curtain for the last act began to descend at 7:07 when Admiral Fitch called down from his bridge to the captain, "Well, Ted, let's get the men off." Captain Sherman gave the order that stabs the heart of every sailor who loves his ship, and this happy ship was loved as few ships have been before or since. Abandonment was deliberate, methodical, and exceedingly reluctant. Donut rafts were tossed overboard, and the Marines and bluejackets, after setting their shoes in an orderly line on the flight deck, descended hand over hand on lifelines. Rear Admiral Kincaid in Minneapolis took charge of rescue operations. Destroyers Morris, Anderson, and Hammond recovered men from the water. Fortunately, the sea was calm and the water warm. It was as luxurious an abandonment as one could expect. One group of men, awaiting their turn to go over the side, scooped up what ice cream remained in the ship's service store. Nobody who went overboard was drowned. Even the captain's dog was saved. Evening brought Lady Lex to her destined end. Admiral Fitch transferred his flag to Minneapolis. Captain Sherman and his executive officer, Commander M.T. Seligman, made a final inspection to ensure that no wounded were left behind, and while so engaged had to dodge flying debris from another explosion. Last three to go down hand over hand were a corporal of Marines, the executive officer, and the skipper, in that order. Admiral Fletcher ordered Destroyer Phelps to administer the coup de grace with torpedoes. At about 20, the battered Amazon gave up her ghost with one final and awful detonation as, head up, she slipped into a 2,400-fathom deep. During the afternoon of the 8th of May, Admiral Nimitz, who had received a radio report of the battle, ordered Task Force 17 to retire from the Coral Sea. That is what Fletcher had intended to do. Next day, Nimitz seriously considered cancelling this order, but let it stand. For reasoned sink-pack staff, the enemy had retired. His main objective, the invasion of Port Moresby, had been thwarted. Any carrier not completely effective is singularly vulnerable, and inflicting damage on your enemy is no compensation for being sunk yourself. Moreover, Nimitz had to husband his air power for the defence of Midway, which was coming up presently. Admiral Fletcher led his force south during the night, and in the morning began a gradual change of course to the eastward. On the afternoon of the 11th of May, he separated the ships into two groups. One, under the command of Rear Admiral Kincaid with 3 cruisers and 4 destroyers, was sent into Noumea, while Fletcher himself led the rest toward Tongatabu. Retirement from the scene of battle was not completed without one amusing incident. On the morning of the 9th of May, one of Yorktown's planes reported an aircraft carrier 75 miles away from Task Force 17. Dive bombers were immediately launched from the flagship, and in response to a call for help, 14 Army bombers took off from an Australian base. As luck would have it, on this one occasion when Army and Navy managed to stage a coordinated attack, their target turned out to be a small island or reef. Aside from this false start, during that day and the 2 following, the Army Air Force concentrated on beating up the enemy seaplane base at Boyne Island. After these attacks had destroyed most of their planes and shore installations, the Japanese folded up. Japanese movements after the battle were less consistent. At about May 8th, a few hours after Shokaku had departed, Admiral Inouye, assuming Task Force 17 had been liquidated, ordered Takagi to retire to Truk. Before the end of the day, Inouye formally postponed the Port Moresby invasion. The new date, the 3rd of July, turned out to be the equivalent of the classic Greek kalends. One may well ask what now prevented the Port Moresby invasion group from reversing course again and steaming through Jomard Passage to its original destination instead of returning to Simpson Harbour, Rabaul. The Army Air Force may take a bow for that. Inouye did not dare to risk his transports in a second try because of the intense activity of the AAF along the southern shores of Papua and the want of air protection now that Shoho was sunk and the striking force had retired. Admiral Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet, apparently did not appreciate Inouye's caution, since at midnight May 8th he ordered Takagi to annihilate remaining enemy forces. So at 2, May 9th, Zuikaku and her consorts turned southeast and later southwest. Takagi could hardly have hoped to intercept Fletcher that late, but orders were orders. At noon, May 10th, the rest of Goto's covering group, which changed missions as often as Inouye changed his mind, joined Zuikaku, but within an hour of picking them up, the carrier countermarched. Next day, Takagi received definite orders to leave the area. On the 10th of May, Admiral Shima's invasion force, destined for Ocean and Nauru Islands, got underway from Rabaul, only to lose flagship Okinoshima to United States submarine S-42 next day, and to be recalled to Truk on the 15th, when a patrol plane warned Inouye that unfriendly carriers had been sighted some 450 miles cast of Tulagi. That was Halsey's task force roaring down from Pearl, but it was too late for Enterprise and Hornet to change the situation. They never entered the amaranthine waters of the Coral Sea, now unvexed by the keels of fighting ships. News of the battle, which reached the United States on Saturday the 9th of May, caused much speculation. It provoked the conservative New York Times to splash streamer headlines across its front page: Japanese repulsed in Great Pacific Battle with 17 to 22 of their ships sunk or crippled. Enemy in flight, pursued by Allied warships. Hanson Baldwin admitted that the future course of the war in the Pacific and in the world may be hanging in the balance, and this battle bids fair to be the greatest in American naval history. But he observed that since we were fighting a 7-ocean war with a 1-ocean navy, it was premature to claim a victory or to interpret a defeat. The Japanese claimed, besides sinking mythical battleships in Admiral Crace's force, that they had sent both large carriers to the bottom. Hitler complimented his honorary Aryan allies with what must eventually have seemed a dismal prophecy. After this new defeat, the United States warships will hardly dare to face the Japanese fleet again, since any United States warship which accepts action with the Japanese naval forces is as good as lost. Like Falstaff, when he warned of news abroad, the Navy Department declared no credence should be given to claims that have been or may be put out by Tokyo. In order to keep the enemy guessing, it was not until after the Midway victory that the department released a worthy account of the Coral Sea battle and admitted the loss of Lexington. So, for over a month, claims and counterclaims piled up. Prime Minister Curtin of Australia was so alarmed as to warn his people that invasion is a menace capable of becoming an actuality at any hour. He bluntly reminded the legislature that men are fighting for Australia today, and those who are not fighting have no excuse for not working. The Battle of the Coral Sea will be ever memorable as the first purely carrier-against-carrier naval battle in which all losses were inflicted by air action and no ship on either side sighted a surface enemy. But the confident prediction of air power enthusiasts that it had set a pattern which would always be followed proved to be premature. It was a tactical victory for the Japanese, but a strategic victory for the United States. The enemy inflicted relatively greater losses than he sustained. Shoho and the few small ships sunk at Tulagi were a cheap price to pay for Neosho, Sims, and Lexington. On the other hand, the main purpose of the Japanese operation, the capture of Port Moresby, was thwarted. The Louisiades proved to be a barrier beyond which no warship flying the banner of the rising sun could ever pass. Tulagi, one of the two secondary objectives of the enemy, had been won, and it cost us dear to root him out of it. But in the other scale one must place the temporary elimination of Shokaku and Zuikaku. The one was so damaged that she could not rejoin the fleet for 2 months, and the other, owing to plane losses, was out of the war until about the 12th of June, when she went up to the Aleutians. If these two fine carriers with veteran pilots had been able to participate in the Battle of Midway, they might well have supplied the necessary margin for victory. So many mistakes were made on both sides in this new mode of fighting that it might be called the Battle of Naval Errors. But more were made by the enemy, and he failed to profit by them. The experience of Lady Lex, paradoxically, instead of showing that carriers were fragile and easily cracked shells, proved they were tough ships capable of absorbing punishment far beyond pre-war expectation. Her loss merely added another illustration to that old adage beginning, "For want of a nail, the shoe was lost." If one electric motor had not been left running, there would probably have been no gasoline explosion and no sinking. Once more, the inadequacy of American carrier aircraft was emphasized, but improved models were already coming off the assembly lines. The ratio of fighter planes to bombers and torpedo planes was increased, and in the short month that remained before Midway, some improvement was effected in the organization and precision of air attack. There is no teacher of combat that can even remotely approach the value of combat itself. Call Coral Sea what you will, it was an indispensable preliminary to the great victory of Midway. The morale value of the battle to all Allied nations, coming as it did immediately after the surrender of Corregidor, was immeasurable. Captain Sherman's statement, articles by shipboard correspondents, and numerous interviews with survivors printed in their hometown papers told a story of cool efficiency, relentless action, superb heroism, and determination. That story of the last fight of Lady Lex, her calm abandonment, the devotion of her crew to their ship and their captain, transcended mere history. The American people took it to their hearts and stored it up in the treasury of folk memory. To the vast majority of Americans who had the privilege of spending leave or liberty in that gallant city of the Antipodes, the Battle of Sydney was fought within the confines of the Australia Hotel, Romano's, or other well-known hot spots. Yet there actually was a brief battle in the world's most beautiful harbour, between 2 American warships and 2 tiny submarines. Although the midget submarine attack on Pearl Harbor had been a complete failure, and most Japanese naval officers regarded such efforts with contempt, there had been so great a propaganda build-up for the little 2-man jobs that the High Command decided to make another. After the Battle of the Coral Sea, Admiral Crace's support group was returned to MacArthur's Navy, of which it then constituted the principal strength. USS Chicago and Perkins on the 3rd of May were moored in Sydney Harbour, ready to depart after an unusually pleasant period of upkeep and overhaul. Destroyer tender Dobbin, which had arrived a day earlier with a load of torpedoes and warheads, was swinging to a buoy awaiting a chance to land her cargo. HMAS Kuttabul, an old ferry boat converted to a barracks ship, was tied up at a stone dock at the Garden Island Naval Station, close inshore from Chicago, with a Royal Netherlands submarine moored outboard and alongside. Woolloomooloo Pier was filled with the usual laughing throng of Aussies, sailors and girls taking advantage of a Sunday full moon, and although Sydney observed what the city fathers called a brownout, Garden Island was brilliantly illuminated with high floodlights which beautifully silhouetted the anchored ships for any approaching enemy. The channel from the outer heads to Port Jackson is a narrow and winding passage some 6 miles in length, difficult to navigate at the best of times, and the Australian authorities had not yet got around to closing it with anti-submarine nets and boom. As soon as the Coral Sea operation was over, 5 I-class Japanese submarines carrying 4 midget submarines and 1 plane started south. The plane made an unobserved reconnaissance flight over Port Jackson, and the midgets were launched off the heads on the 31st of May. 1 or 2 of them succeeded in making their way up the channel after dark, astern of a fishing vessel. Detected both by the fishermen and by a magnetic underwater loop, their presence was signalled by the naval command at Sydney to ships at anchor by 22:30, but nothing was done to douse the lights at Garden Island or stop ferryboats from running. At 22:57, lookouts in Chicago sighted a conning tower awash 300 yards on her starboard quarter. She illuminated the target and opened fire with her 5-inch battery and machine guns, but they could not be depressed for so short a range, and some of the shots ricocheted into a residential section of Sydney, where fortunately they did no damage. The story that the only casualty inflicted by Chicago's gunfire was a lion in the famous Sydney Zoo, and that Captain Bode was requested to provide a new one out of Lend-Lease, is the invention of an Australian humorist. The midget dived, and Perkins got under way at 23:16 to cover the cruiser and Dobbin, but her sound gear was ineffective owing to the many noises set up by ferryboats and other harbour craft which continued to ply to and fro. 2 Australian corvettes also began searching, and when one of them relieved Perkins, Captain Bode at 22:43 ordered her to pick up her old buoy inshore of Chicago. Apparently the skipper of Chicago thought he had holed the only midget present. At half an hour past midnight, the wake of a torpedo, evidently aimed at Chicago, was observed to pass close aboard the cruiser. It went under the Dutch submarine and the barracks boat and detonated with a great roar and flash against the dock. The concussion blew the bottom out of the ex-ferryboat, killing a number of sailors who were sleeping on board, and left it a total loss. Perkins at once resumed patrolling and sent her boats in to fight fires and rescue the wounded. At 2:15, June 1, Chicago and Perkins, on orders of the Naval Command at Sydney, stood out to sea. The cruiser, when close to South Head Gas Buoy, passed the periscope of an entering midget so close that one could almost look down it from the bridge. Whether this midget had already been in and out, or was entering for the first time, is not known. During the day, 2 damaged and scuttled midgets, complete with the deceased 4 crew members, were discovered on the bottom of Sydney Harbour. They had probably scuttled themselves when their mission was completed. Chicago and Perkins re-entered the harbour during the afternoon to recover their boats, and promptly left for good. Japanese Imperial Headquarters issued a communique giving a lurid description of HM battleship Warspite going up in flames and sinking. This bit of misinformation appears to have given the Japanese great satisfaction. The anniversary was celebrated with appropriate speeches and newspaper articles in 1943 and 1944. Apparently, the I-boats that brought the midgets south waited around for a week in the hope of recovering them. At about 0:20 June 8, 7 shells fired from a submarine lying 3.5 miles off Cape Banks fell into a Sydney suburb, demolishing 1 house but harming nobody. The submarine, fired upon by a coastal battery, was last seen heading north on the surface. Air search failed to locate it. Both this Battle of Sydney and a similar midget submarine attack on Diego Suarez, Madagascar, on the previous day, were doubtless intended as diversions in connection with Midway. Since a midget submarine attack had heralded the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese wished to create the impression that their next move would be to the south and west, instead of to the north and east. Be that as it may, Admiral Nimitz refused to bite, for he knew that the enemy was about to attack in his direction, not down under. Shortly before battle was joined in the Coral Sea, word had reached Admiral Nimitz of a forthcoming enemy offensive in the Central Pacific that threatened to be far more powerful and dangerous than the one about to be stopped at the Louisiades. There had been some inkling of this 2 months earlier. On the night of the 4th of March 1942, Oahu was raided by 2 enemy 4-engined flying boats. Owing to a fortunate overcast, they missed Pearl Harbor and dropped 4 bombs harmlessly into the Punchbowl crater behind Honolulu. Although these planes were not sighted, experts figured out what they were from the sound and from bomb fragments, and on the 10th of March, one of this type, which we nicknamed Emily, was detected off Midway and shot down after a sharp fight by 4 Marine Corps Buffaloes. Where could such planes have come from? By a process of elimination, they must have staged through Watje Atoll and refueled from a submarine in the lee of French frigate Shoals, 490 miles WNW of Oahu, and just south of the direct air route to Midway. That estimate was correct. The Pineapple Navy, the patrol and other small craft of Hawaiian Sea Frontier Forces, then undertook to deny French frigate Shoals to enemy submarines, and the approaches were mined. YP-277 was blown up by a friendly mine off the shoals, and others ran out of fuel when far from home, but they did the job. Moves of this sort are shadows of events to come unless they are mere shadows of shadows, deceptive warfare. Nimitz believed that they portended an offensive toward Hawaii, and he was right. "Midway Island acts as a sentry for Hawaii," said Admiral Nagumo in his report on the Great Battle. Situated 1135 miles WNW of Pearl Harbor, Midway is the farthest outpost of the Hawaiian chain, excepting the small unoccupied Kure Atoll, 60 miles beyond. Smaller even than Wake, Midway is similarly devoid of Polynesians, coconut palms, and the usual attributes of South Sea islands. The entire atoll is but 6 miles in diameter, and only a small proportion of that is dry land. Of the 2 islets, Sand and Eastern, the first is less than 2 miles long, and the other a little more than 1. A barrier reef rises a few feet above sea level and forms a breakwater around both islets, enclosing one fair harbour and a lagoon that is mostly foul ground. Midway Atoll, first reported in 1859 by the American master of an Hawaiian bark and promptly claimed for his native country, was formally taken into American possession by USS Lackawanna on the 28th of August 1867 on orders from Secretary Gideon Welles. The Pacific Mail Steamship Company was responsible for this early assertion of American imperialism because it wished to establish a coaling station. As the deep lagoon in the center could only be reached over a 6-foot bar, the Navy obtained an appropriation of $50,000 in 1869 for dredging a ship channel between Sand and Eastern Islands. Next year, USS Saginaw rode out the first dredges and carried up workers and supplies. At the end of 7 months, when the channel was only deep enough for small boats in calm weather, the money had all been spent. Saginaw was wrecked on Kure, and during the next 30 years, nobody except Japanese feather hunters took an interest in Midway. A new chapter opened in 1903 when the Pacific Commercial Cable Company decided to establish there a station on its Honolulu-Guam-Manila line. President Theodore Roosevelt issued an order placing Midway under the jurisdiction and control of the Navy Department, and on the 3rd of June 1903, the redoubtable Hugh Rodman, then a lieutenant commander and skipper of USS Iroquois, using no weapon but his powerful voice and commanding personality, chased off a party of Japanese feather collectors. During that year, the cable was laid and a station established. The Navy set out mooring buoys, built a lighthouse on Sand Island, and for 4 years stationed a 20-man Marine Guard to protect the station. This cable to Honolulu was of immense value to the Navy during the Great Battle of 1942. It handled most of the heavy traffic incident to a big naval operation, leaving the volume of radio communication normal so that the enemy did not suspect what was going on. Superintendents of the cable station brought a few amenities to this desolate atoll. Sand Island, which had hitherto grown little vegetation but the skeevala bush, became a garden spot with Australian ironwood trees, eucalyptus, shrubs, lawns, spacious quarters for the employees, and even tennis courts for their recreation. From 1920 on, the United States Navy occasionally stationed an oiler in Wells Harbour to fuel destroyers. In 1934, when the Naval Limitation Treaty with its anti-defense clauses was denounced by Japan, the Navy studied the possibilities of Midway as a seaplane base. Pan American Airways picked up the ball in 1935, made Sand Island an airport for its trans-Pacific clippers, constructed a seaplane ramp, new quarters, and a small hotel on the lagoon side. Navy seaplanes flew to Midway from Honolulu and Marines, captured the island during the fleet problem of 1935, the one which pacifists regarded as a menace to Japan. About that time, United States Army engineers started to blast out a ship channel between the two islets. It was first used by the minesweeper Swan in 1940. In consequence of the Hepburn Report on Pacific Bases, which declared that the Midway Air Base was second in importance only to Pearl Harbor, construction of facilities for Catalina patrol planes began under naval direction in March 1940. NAS, Naval Air Station Midway, was commissioned the 18th of August 1941, with Commander Cyril T. Simard as the first CO. By that time, Sand Island had become a populous town with hundreds of contractors' workmen, a defence battalion of the Fleet Marine Force, a large seaplane hangar and artificial harbour, fuel tanks and numerous other buildings. One 5,300-foot strip for land-based aircraft had been completed on Eastern Island, and contracts for further construction had been awarded to the amount of $250 million. Midway received the news of the Pearl Harbor Blitz at 6:30 the 7th of December 1941. The Japanese striking force had approached Oahu by a course well outside the cruising radius of the Catalinas stationed at Midway, but an independent task group consisting of 2 new destroyers, accompanied by a fleet tender, bombarded the atoll that night. A marine lookout reported a flashing light to the southwestward at 1842. 3 hours later, the destroyers opened fire. The Marines' coast defence guns returned it and claimed 3 hits. At 22, the enemy retired after eliminating 4 and wounding 10 men, burning the roof of the seaplane hangar and most of the stores therein, knocking out the Pan American radio direction finder, and destroying 1 Catalina. During the week before Christmas, Midway was reinforced by 17 V-Ort Vindicators and a Marine fighter plane squadron. USS Tangier, after landing various supplies and personnel originally intended for the relief of Wake, took away all but a few of the contractors' workmen. This civilian construction gang, described by one observer as the scum of the West Coast, had been great bullies and fighters up to the 7th of December, but became demoralized by the brief bombardment. Most of the men scattered into the bush where they made dugouts for themselves and lived on appropriated food. Others circulated among the garrison, and the diary of the Naval Air Station shows almost daily commitment of civilians to the local Husago for suspicious or demoralizing attitudes, statements, or actions. As Admiral Nagumo remarked, the importance of Midway was enhanced when we lost Wake. It was now the westernmost American base in the Pacific. By the same token, it was coveted by the enemy. As the atoll lay beyond the range of Wake-based search planes, the Japanese could not observe what was going on. 3 attempts to bombard the atoll by surfaced submarines were unsuccessful, owing to good shooting by marine planes and coast defence batteries. The Japanese High Command were not much disturbed by their setback in the Coral Sea. Tulagi was in the bag. Port Moresby, they believed, could be captured at leisure. Reports of Allied losses in the battle were very satisfactory. No backdoor interference by the British Far Eastern Fleet was anticipated. Nagumo's Easter raid on Ceylon had taken care of that. So without loss of a day, the Japanese Navy went ahead with its plans to gobble up Midway and the Western Aleutians. The capture of these islands was the most important objective in the second great Japanese offensive that began with the drive on Port Moresby to end with the conquest of Samoa, Fiji, and Noumea. As the basic strategy of this offensive has already been discussed, we may now concentrate on the special reasons for taking Midway and the Western Aleutians. These islands were wanted to repair that rip in the ribbon defence through which Halsey had dashed in April to bomb Tokyo. They would serve as key points in a new outer perimeter: Kiska, Midway, Wake, Marshalls, Gilbert's, Guadalcanal, Port Moresby. Midway-based patrol planes, in conjunction with others flying out of Kiska and Wake, would be able to detect any task force attempting to raid Japan's inner defence. Midway was an important forward fueling point for the United States submarines, which were beginning to annoy shipping near Japan. But, from Yamamoto's point of view, the principal value of Midway was to draw Nimitz out. Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet knew that he must annihilate the United States Pacific Fleet in 1942 or lose the war. For Yamamoto, unlike most of the Nipponese warlords, appreciated American strength and resources. Knowing that these would tell with the passage of time, he argued that Japan must threaten something that America valued in order to get the Pacific Fleet into a position where it could be wiped out, and what could be better bait than Midway? Nimitz could not let that sentry to Hawaii go by default like Wake, and whatever he did about it would involve a movement of the Pacific Fleet westward to a position where the combined fleet could strike. Yamamoto converted Admiral Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, to his strategy, and they convinced Imperial Headquarters, which on the 5th of May 1942 issued the terse order, Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet will, in cooperation with the Army, invade and occupy strategic points in the Western Aleutians and Midway Island. This was the second phase of the 1942 strategy. Plans for the third phase occupation of the Fijis, Samoa, and New Caledonia were activated as early as the 18th of May. Pearl Harbor was no objective of the Midway operation. "We wanted to go to Pearl Harbor," said a member of Yamamoto's staff, "but it was not authorized." The Japanese intended to seize French frigate shoals and other islets en route to Pearl, and to stage nuisance raids from Midway on the great naval base. But future events would decide whether or not they needed Oahu. It was perfectly clear to these Oriental disciples of Mahan that they must defeat the United States Pacific Fleet before attempting to take and hold Pearl, and that conversely, if Nimitz succeeded in saving his fleet, Midway could not long be held by Japan. Although Yamamoto's strategy was logical, not as much can be said of his operation plan. It comprised 3 separate but mutually supporting actions: occupation of Western Aleutians, occupation of Midway, fleet engagement. These objectives were to be carried by 5 major forces, some of them subdivided into 2 or more groups, and all proceeding eastward independently. In brief, these forces were -1, Advance Expeditionary Force, 3 groups of submarines; 2, Carrier Striking Force, comprising 4 of the 6 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor. Admiral Nagumo still flew his flag in Akagi, pride of the Japanese carrier fleet, and the 2nd Carrier Division was commanded by Admiral Yamaguchi, who had been naval attaché at Washington before the war. Commander Minoru Genda, the most highly esteemed planner of Japanese air tactics, was on Nagumo's staff. He was the one person for whose safety, in the course of the coming battle, Yamamoto expressed concern. Midway Occupation Force, Admiral Kondo, Commander-in-Chief of the 2nd Fleet, which had played a leading part in the conquest of the Indies. This comprised a covering group of battleships and heavy cruisers, Admiral Kurita's close support group of 4 more heavy cruisers, a transport group carrying the occupation force, 2 seaplane tenders, and a minesweeper group. Main body, under Admiral Yamamoto's personal command, including the 3 latest battleships and a light carrier, and the Aleutian screening force of 4 battleships and 2 light cruisers. Northern Area Force, Admiral Hosogaya, comprising the 2nd Mobile Force of 2 carriers and 3 heavy cruisers, and the 2 occupation forces for Adak-Atu and Kiska. The overall plan was as follows. The 2nd Mobile Force was to open the battle by delivering a paralyzing air bombardment on Dutch Harbour on the 3rd of June in order to confuse Kimitz and cover the occupation of the Western Aleutians. The carrier striking force, after softening up Midway, was to deliver the first blow at the Pacific Fleet if it challenged, while the main body, commanded by Yamamoto in person, moved up for the finish from a supporting position to the westward. In the meantime, after nightfall the 5th of June, Midway Island would be attacked by the 5,000 ground troops of the occupation force, and would be promptly developed as an airbase. The Aleutian support force was to be detached from the main body to take station halfway between Midway and the Aleutians, and to intercept any American force that came either way. There were many other details which never came into operation, such as minesweeping and the setting up of seaplane and midget submarine bases at Kure Atoll northwest of Midway. Land-based air searches were flown from Marcus, Wake, and Paramushiro. If Yamamoto's overall strategy was correct, the actual deployment of his forces to effect this result seems cockeyed. Why did he plan it so? We may never know. Yamamoto was shot down by the Solomons Air Command on the 18th of April 1943, and after the war his flag officers either did not know what had been in the old maestro's mind or believed in the adage de mortuis nil nisi bonum. His objectives are well known: occupation of Midway and Kiska and a big fleet action. Why then, in the name of the sainted Togo, did he not keep his fleet together instead of dispersing it all over the North Pacific, exposing it to defeat in detail by a much weaker American force? The combined fleet was, however, deployed in accordance with Japanese strategic habits. They overvalued surprise, which had worked so well at the beginning, and always assumed they could get it. They loved diversionary tactics, forces popping up at odd places to confuse the enemy and pull him off base. They believed that the pattern for decisive battle was the same at sea as on land: lure the enemy into an unfavourable tactical situation, cut off his retreat, drive in his flanks, and then concentrate for the kill. Their manual for carrier force commanders even invoked the examples of Hannibal at Cannae and Ludendorff at Tannenberg to justify just such naval strategy as Yamamoto tried at Midway. Thus, the preliminary airstrike on Dutch Harbour was primarily a gambit intended to pull the Pacific Fleet up north where it would not interfere with the occupation of Midway. But why did Yamamoto hold back his powerful battleships of the main body where they could not get into the fight? Why, if he wanted a fleet action, did he not keep them near the carriers? Here is the probable explanation. Yamamoto, counting on surprise, expected no opposition to his invasion of Midway. He knew that the Pacific Fleet had no fast battleships, underestimated the number of carriers at its disposal, and never expecting that Nimitz would be wise to his movements, anticipated no challenge to develop until several days after Midway had been secured. By that time, substantial forces in Pearl Harbor might be tearing up north to protect Dutch Harbor, and even if Nimitz had decided to let the situation develop, he would be unable to reach Midway until 7 or the 8th of June at the earliest. Nagumo's carriers would then be in readiness to strike the challenging fleet, perhaps get between it and Midway, which by that time would be a Japanese fixed airplane carrier. Then Yamamoto's main body, and the various battleship and heavy cruiser divisions that had accompanied outlying forces, would close for the elimination. His carrier pilots would have been rested, every ship would have had a big drink of oil, and the numerically inferior Pacific Fleet should have been annihilated. Alternately, if Nimitz refused to bite in the first week of June, he would certainly try to recapture Midway within a month or two, and the combined fleet would be ready in the Marshalls to pounce on him. The vital defect in this sort of plan is that it depends on the enemy's doing exactly what is expected. If he is smart enough to do something different, in this case to have fast carriers on the spot, the operation in his dual capacity as Commander-in-Chief, Pacific, and Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Ocean Area, exercised strategic and broad tactical direction of all American forces, naval or military, deployed in the Pacific Ocean outside General MacArthur's area. Fortunately, he could cut his counter-strategy to fit the enemy's, since intelligence fed him a fairly accurate account of Japanese plans and preparations, deduced from various bits of information from a variety of sources. Nimitz declared a state of fleet-opposed invasion in the Hawaiian sea frontier on the 14th of May, in agreement with the commanding General Hawaiian Department. Admiral King, on the 15th, predicted that an expeditionary force for the capture of Midway would depart Guam about the 24th of May. Orders were promptly issued from Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Headquarters, for every ship of the Pacific Fleet that had been engaged at Coral Sea to hasten back to Pearl, but it must not be supposed that these predictions and deductions went unchallenged. Certain important officers, both at Honolulu and in Washington, believed that all these indications were an elaborate hoax of the Japanese to cover another raid on Pearl Harbor, or even on the west coast. Admiral Nimitz made the first vital decision of the campaign in accepting the estimate of his fleet intelligence officer that Midway and the Aleutians were the enemy's real objectives. As early as the 20th of May, Admiral Nimitz issued an estimate of the enemy force that was accurate as far as it went, and even alarming. What he did not know was that Admiral Yamamoto himself, in the super battleship Yamato, was to command the main body of the combined fleet, comprising 3 new and 4 old battleships, 3 light cruisers, a destroyer squadron, and a light carrier, to operate between Midway and the Aleutians and cover both. Although the picture was not complete the composition, approximate routes and timetable of the enemy forces that immediately threatened Midway were so accurately deduced that on the 23rd of May, Rear Admiral Bellinger, the naval air commander at Pearl, was able to predict the Japanese plan of attack on the atoll. But for this early and abundant information, and the prompt and intelligent use of it, the Pacific Fleet would have had only a slim chance of winning. As it was, the 3 weeks preceding Midway were the most tense and anxious experienced by Nimitz's staff during the entire war. Anxiety was never more justified. The carrier situation was critical. Saratoga, her repairs completed, was training her air group at San Diego. Lexington had been sunk and Yorktown damaged at Coral Sea. After that battle, Admiral Fitch estimated it would take about 90 days to repair Yorktown, but the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard did it in less than 2. She limped into port at 14:30 May 27th with her bowels in disorder from a bomb explosion and leaking from near misses. The big dry dock took her in that afternoon. Over 1,400 men, shipfitters, shipwrights, machinists, welders, electricians poured in, over and under the ship. They and the yard shopmen worked in shifts the rest of that day and the next, and during the whole of 2 nights, making the bulkhead stanchions and deck plates necessary to restore the ship's structural strength, and replacing the wiring, instruments, and fixtures damaged in the blast. There was no time to make blueprints or to draft plans. Templates of parts that needed replacement were fashioned in wood and hustled ashore to the appropriate shop, where the replacements were made in record time, carried on board on the double, and installed. At 11 May 29th, the dock was flooded. Yorktown moved into the stream with hundreds of men still working on her, fueled that afternoon, took on replacement planes, and sailed at 9 on the following day. Her new air group, a composite from 3 different carriers, first operated as a unit in the forthcoming battle. Enterprise and Hornet of Halsey's Task Force 16, which had been rushed down south after the Tokyo raid but arrived too late for the Battle of Coral Sea, came tearing back and re-entered Pearl on the 26th of May. Enterprise was the best of our carriers, with a seasoned air group. Hornet's air group had had no battle experience. Vice Admiral Halsey, who had been under great strain for 6 months, broke out with an irritating skin disease and had to go to the hospital. Admiral Nimitz appointed Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, who had commanded Halsey's heavy cruisers, to relieve him as task force commander. A happy choice indeed, for Spruance was not merely competent, he had the level head and cool judgment that would be required to deal with new contingencies and a fluid situation. A man secure within. Not himself an aviator, Spruance took over Halsey's staff, including his temperamental but highly intelligent Chief of Staff, Captain Miles Browning. At that time, the Pacific Fleet included not one battleship with the speed to operate with fast-stepping carriers. Vice Admiral William S. Pye's Battleship Task Force, after several weeks shuttling between West Coast ports, Hawaii and the Line Islands, anchored in San Francisco Bay. Owing in part to the insulting attitude of San Franciscans toward battleship sailors on liberty, all hands from the Admiral down were eager to get into the fight. Nimitz, however, refused to include them in the picture because he could afford them no air cover, and because the forthcoming operation promised no suitable occasion for the use of their striking power. As one of the primary duties of Commander-in-Chief, Pacific was to protect and maintain the lifeline to the Antipodes. He did not see fit to halt the regular movement of convoys to and from the West Coast and Panama to Samoa, Noumea, Australia and New Zealand. And all these had to have destroyer escort. Thus, Admiral Nimitz had to meet Japanese carriers, battleships and heavy cruisers with a smaller number of every type. The most acute question before his staff was whether to concentrate against the attack on Midway, leaving the Aleutians to their fate, or to do something to protect our far-flung possessions in the north. After much discussion, the Admiral on the 17th of May decided to form a North Pacific force consisting of heavy cruisers, Indianapolis and Louisville, light cruisers, Honolulu, St. Louis and Nashville, and 10 destroyers, under Rear Admiral Robert A. Theobald. Besides deducing a large part of his enemy's plans, Nimitz had another strategic advantage over Yamamoto: shorter distance from base to scene of action. For tactical assets he had first Midway, which accommodated more planes than a carrier and could not be sunk, and second radar. 2 good search radars were installed on Midway. Enterprise had an early type, CXAM, Hornet, Yorktown, and a few of the cruisers had a slightly later one, SC. The circumstances of this battle were such, however, that radar was of little use afloat. The operation plan which Admiral Nimitz issued to all task force, squadron and division commanders on the 27th of May was not one to reassure the faint-hearted. He foretold that the enemy would employ 2 to 4 fast battleships, and he had none. 4 or 5 carriers, and he had 3 at most. 8 or 9 heavy cruisers, and he had 7. 4 or 5 light cruisers, and he had 1. 16 to 24 destroyers, and he had 14, and at least 25 submarines against his 19. And this estimate of Japanese forces did not include the main body, which would have made the balance even less favourable to the United States.